Hello?
Damn. Let's see here. Thurman's still connected. Let me start my video. All right. Good to see you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I didn't have any technical difficulties on the line. I just filmed a guest here in the studio, but I I thought I was like maybe too far away from my router or something. I don't have a hardwire Ethernet in here yet, but I'm getting one. I just haven't got around to it. So,
well, congrats on the new studio.
Thanks. Yeah, it looks I'm glad you guys came by and saw it when it looked like total garbage, because now it looks awesome. It's kind of messy in here, but the remodel went really nice. So, Thurman, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good, good. What's in the jar?
Little cold brew.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, right on. Okay, cool. Yeah.
The owner of Midtown Coffee, he just came by and did an episode, so he brought some brew with him.
Cool. Hi, Julie.
Thurman, what's behind you?
It's a painting that Terry's been working on for like a year and a half.
That's a painting?
Yeah.
That looks awesome.
Dude, yeah, I thought that was your fireplace last time.
No, it's a painting. It's the old art building at Tech.
Oh, wow.
I recognize some university architecture there.
Yeah, it's like one of the oldest buildings on campus, and it's where we met. So
I feel way cooler that I'm drinking this coffee out of a styrofoam cup for some reason.
Yeah, it's very class.
You're destroying the environment.
I know. It was all we had. It was all we had in the party supplies bin for the gym. I had to go rob it.
Yeah.
Hey, did you guys?
At least it's not a red Solo cup. So
that's true.
Too.
Yeah.
Hey, did you guys see today? Stuff circulating about the George Washington statue.
Which statue? Like the monument or one of his?
There's a statue of George Washington, and they put a like a Klan outfit on it, apparently, right?
No.
And said slave owner. I mean, for all I know, it could have been Robert E. Lee wearing the Klan outfit. I don't know, but somebody was like, "This is George Washington's statue. This is what people do to it." And I was like, yeah, but then there's also this picture. I'll see if you guys can see it. This was just brought to my attention today. See Abraham Lincoln here? He's petting this slave, former slave, perhaps.
I have seen that before.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm disturbed by that. I wouldn't mind if we took that down. Anyway.
Yeah, right.
Which is why we're here today.
Yeah. So, like George Washington in a Klan outfit, is that what you said?
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, that's what. Here, let me pull it up. It was George Washington wearing a Klan outfit, and it said slave owner spray painted in red.
Okay.
And it was like him riding a horse. And I was like, oh, I wonder what monument that is. I didn't look into it too much, but I saw it shared like 2 or 3 times on social media. Let's see. But I know they've been vandalizing founding fathers statues. Jefferson had a statue that was having some controversy around it in Missouri.
I think it's the question of like the founding fathers' ideas of freedom, even though at the time they didn't extend to everybody. Does their ideas still hold them up in esteem, or should they also be canceled because they were slave owners?
Yeah. And like so that's been something that's come up for me. People have brought that up a lot, whether it's I'm talking to people that are perpetuating Irish slave myths or whatever. But people have brought that up. Well, what about the founding fathers? And I just tell them, I'm like, well, Thomas Jefferson told us not to put him on anything. And so that this sort of stuff wouldn't happen, I think.
My mom was like, what about Mount Rushmore? Do you want to blow that up? And
somebody said that to me.
I'm open to it. That was sacred Native American land that they built that on.
Yeah.
So if the Native Americans want to get rid of it, I'll be there for the destruction.
Somebody, you know, I made a post about the Native Americans during the Civil War that like they basically only, not only, but a lot of them chose the side of the Confederacy because they weren't receiving tribal annuities from the federal government. And then they were like, didn't receive anything from the Confederacy, then rejoined the Union, you know, but they were like, what about Native Americans? And I was like, I just made a post about them yesterday. I'll tag you in it, I guess.
I feel like people just really want to take the spotlight off of Black people.
Yeah, I
And
think
it's
you're
really
right.
concerning to me. It's like, why? Well, you want to, shift the spotlight to someone else. You do not want it on Black people. Why is that?
Well, and people like, I saw somebody just today sharing up a white guy at like a mall or something, and they're like, see, I see videos like this every day. And I was like, what does that have to, it's comparative suffering. That's like people want to like diminish one person's suffering by saying like, and I'm like, yeah, but you know, the Irish, they were never hereditary slaves though, you know. It wasn't passed on to their children. They had control over their bodies. Like there's all sorts of things you can go into with, on the subject. But
Indentured servitude versus chattel slavery, I think, is a bit different, you know.
yeah, for sure. So, well, Thurman, why don't you lead us off, man? Tell everybody what we're going to talk about and stuff, if you don't mind.
Okay, this is a series that we're going to make over the Lost Cause myth in cinema, and that's in cinema history, of course. So we're going to start kind of with the roots of that. And for those unaware of what the Lost Cause myth is, it's that the Confederate States of America fought the Civil War over these principles, these ideals that were honorable and just and righteous and did not involve slavery at all, and that it was the northern aggressor that came down and caused all kinds of problems. And yeah, that's sort of where we are with that. But we're going to start at the very beginning, which is in 1915, with arguably the first blockbuster American movie, DW Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. Is that good? I mean,
That's good. That's good.
okay. All right.
I got
Which
like
was-
goosebumps.
Okay. Well, what's notable about the movie The Birth of a Nation is that it is a movie that is horrifically racist. It is terribly misleading and inaccurate in its portrayal of not just people, but also of history. But it is also a groundbreaking movie that encapsulated a lot of new innovations in cinema that had never been seen prior to this point. So I think a lot of people have this kind of conflicted ideal of this film. It's like, should we honor this movie because it was forward thinking, because it had so many ideas in terms of its production that hadn't been seen before? Like, it was technically the first feature-length movie. It had innovative use of extras, of close-ups, of editing, of tinting in the film. The narrative structure is interesting. It had reenactment stuff out of history, well, supposed history to DW Griffith, but and it was also the first film, I believe, to have an actual orchestral movie score written for it, which, you know, that's interesting. It was a lavish, big budget production film, but people, I think, have sort of this issue with, do we honor the film because it is innovative, and is that why we sort of keep it around, because its message is complete propaganda? It is just a horrific portrayal of African Americans, of slavery, of Reconstruction. I mean, you can even, I know there are some people who will argue, well, hey, the first half of the movie is not that bad because it deals with the Civil War era, but the second half of the movie is absolutely terrible with the Reconstruction stuff, but I think it's all bad. I mean, I think in terms of its narrative is mostly melodrama, right? I mean, you're focused mostly on these virtuous white characters, right? Who are these archetypes for what Southern people were supposed to be during the Civil War era and the Reconstruction era. But they're not real. I mean, these aren't real people. They're just embodiments of what is supposed to be these attributes of valor and honor, and that it's the black man and his cohorts, the carpetbaggers and the politicians, the Republican politicians during the Reconstruction era who are technically ruining America. Like, there's an interesting scene that is at the beginning of the film, which shows the purchase of a slave, which I believe is supposed to be either in, it's colonial America, right? We're talking like early, like maybe even Puritan times, right? Even though that's somewhat inaccurate too, but that the root of all evil in America is due to the African slave. I mean, that becomes apparent later in this narrative, and it's just it's an abomination. I mean, it's terrible. Like, I mean, I can't sugarcoat that,
I'll say it's the most blatantly racist thing I've ever watched.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was considered racist in 1915.
Right.
Like, the film was boycotted in several major cities. That kind of blew me away, that even, we're watching it now, and I think watching older films, we often think like, oh, this is how it was then, this was accepted as this. This film was not accepted as this. Even at the time, people were like, this is racist, this is not acceptable. And I mean, it was based off a novel called The Klansman. Like, you're bad start with that.
Right, which that's interesting too, because the book was by I'm trying to remember Thomas Dixon. That was the name of the guy who wrote the book, and it was actually a series of books. There were 2 other novels that were involved in this, and apparently they were big sellers. But The Klansman was written roughly 10 years before the production of the film, so 1905, and the film comes out in 1915. And I think also what's intriguing is that prior to DW Griffith's production of The Birth of a Nation, there was an attempt to make The Klansman previous to that in 1911, but it never came to fruition. But so it's like this novel had been kicking around for a bit. So it kind of shows that, this sentiment did exist, right? That people did, I'm not, of course, going to generalize and say everybody felt that way, because obviously, you point out that, hey, people were boycotting this movie. They're saying, hey, this is blatantly racist, this is terrible. And it wasn't just the NAACP who was saying that. You had white people coming out and being like, hey, this is wrong, you can't do this. But I think it's interesting that it's still that even back like in 1905, 1911, 1915, you've got it's just this production like it's bound to happen. Unfortunately, somebody's going to put it up on screen. It's going to happen, and it's just a shame because of that. But blatantly racist, most blatantly racist film I've ever seen too. I'll say that's probably the best description. If you were to write like a 1-sentence review of it, it would probably be something like technically brilliant, comma, the most racist film I've ever seen. That's
Yes. What do you want? You guys say something about rinsing your mind out with bleach or something like that after you watched it?
You definitely need to take a shower with bleach and a Brillo pad after you see it. It's bad. I mean, we can pinpoint specific scenes and all, but it's my question. A question that I was thinking while I was watching this was sort of, what do we do with a film like this, especially today, right? I mean, like, we have the controversy now with Gone with the Wind being pulled from HBO Max, right? But what do we do with a film like, I mean, which Gone with the Wind is universally accepted as this great movie. You know, I mean, it's the American Film Institute, even like 10, 12 years ago, ranked it like in the top 10 American movies ever made. You know, and but what do we do with a film like The Birth of a Nation? What do we do with that? It's the question like with, and to me, I was seeing parallels kind of with the Confederate statues, right? What do we do with that? And what do we do with a film like The Birth of a Nation? Because it's not history. I mean, it is film history, but it's not history, right? Sort of like the Confederate statues are not real history. They're sort of somebody's interpretation of what happened, which is totally fictitious. But it's, you know, there's somebody's idea of what do we do with it? Do we ban it? Is there some way we can put some type of context into it? I mean, what do we do? Because it is achievement-wise, it is a landmark film, but it's a conundrum. It's a problem.
Let me ask you this. What do you
I was going to say,
Oh, go ahead, Julie. Sorry.
since it's film, it's considered art. So do we censor art is the question.
Right, yeah.
I don't think we want to go there. So I do think, you know, and that's what they are doing with Gone with the Wind, is providing historical context when they introduce the film. I think having historical context is good because, as we've seen with Birth of a Nation, it's not just racist, it is a fear-mongering film. It led to the resurgence of the Klan.
Right, yeah.
Some people are boycotting it. It spoke to a bunch of racists in order to get the Klan going again. And just watching it too, you know, the fear that African Americans are going to overtake our government and basically take revenge on white people and abuse all our white women. Like, those are dangerous ideas.
Right.
But
well, I mean, right.
Right.
It's not just only, you know, is it going to be the Black Menace or whatever, but it's also that the federal government is helping this happen too, right? And it's all the poor Southerners, you know, they're still on their own. They're not, you know, they're not part of this. But right, in one of the books that I actually read and used in my thesis, it's called Enemies Within, and it's just about conspiracy theories, and America actually talks about Birth of a Nation in there and says that it is essentially like the first conspiracy movie. And I thought that was like really, you know, kind of intriguing, you know, but
that is, yeah.
Yeah, because it denotes this sort of plot that you have, right, the freed blacks and the government who are conspiring together to pretty much take what they want from the South and rule over it. And that, right, as Julie was saying, this movie led to the resurgence of the KKK, and it did incite riots. I mean, race riots.
Yeah, you know, and like, so I remember this would have been 07, 08, 09 when I was in school. I was taking intro to film. Like, this is something that came up in that class. So I think maybe one question is like, so a debate is, do we study it as like a piece of film and like, okay, well, this is something that we're going to handle over here in this humanity particularly, or this liberal fine art English department, technically, right, academically speaking. But whereas like, so like, that's the biggest thing I've heard about, like the thing that I've been advocating for with the monuments is like, yes, not in public spaces. A museum makes a lot of sense. But it's like, so what do we, you know, Gone with the Wind having some like a disclaimer, like with, but I don't know what to do with Birth of a Nation, right? Like, it's a little bit, it's a little further removed. I feel like it would be an easier cleanup. Like, do either one of you guys have Disney Plus? I know that seems off base, but like, if you go watch Lady and the Tramp, for example, there's a warning at the beginning. Right. It's like, hey, we have these racist stereotypes portraying with these Siamese cats. Right. That's basically what it says. But it's like, so it, you know, pulling it, like, that's been everybody, I feel like, has kind of said the same thing on the Gone with the Wind. Let's pull it until we can figure out what to do. Like something like maybe what Disney has done. But like, still, like, I kind of like intro to film mention it for the techniques what you were saying earlier with Birth of a Nation, but like it's a fiction and it has some terrible, terrible aspects about it. It's like, what do we do with that? I mean, yes, Gone with the Wind has its own things. We could talk about that in a little bit, but what, like, I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where to fit it. It has the cinematic value only to me.
That's why I don't think it should be banned entirely, because obviously you can learn a lot about, you know, the history of the time period this film is coming out. That's why I think it needs the context, because that is really interesting and important to know. But, you know, you don't need to be showing this on Thanksgiving weekends or having like David Duke style movie screenings of Birth of a Nation. Like it should not, you know how, what is it? What some of the theaters will show like The Great Escape or all these like classic films. It does not need to be in that space, much like the Confederate monuments. It doesn't need to be in a space where it's being honored, but it should be still remembered for historical context.
Right. I think that's a good point. It's sort of like because I view this film as propaganda. That's what I view it as, right? And we're all probably pretty much agreed with that, right? That this is an early form of a propaganda film, which is interesting because somebody's doing this in 1915, sort of before like the Soviets took on to the idea and started using it, or even the Nazis, right? With like Triumph of the Will as a notable propaganda film. But one of the aspects, I guess, that really bothers me about Birth of a Nation, and because I mean it is a propaganda film, and Brian, you kind of mentioned earlier that it's a narrative film, but in a way it masquerades itself as being history. It has scenes in it that are supposed to be ripped right from the history pages, right? Like you have Lincoln's assassination in there, which fairly well done, actually. I mean, that's not bad, right? But then you have this other stuff in there, like the absolutely horrendous meeting of the South Carolina Congress, right, where you have all these Black Americans in there now, and they got their feet all propped up on the desk, and they're eating chicken, and then you have the poor white minority folks over here who can't get a vote in on anything, and it's like, come on, no, it's propaganda that tried to turn the oppressors, which were the white Southerners, into the oppressed, and it wasn't like that.
What are some other tenets of the Lost Cause myth that you see perpetuated in the film, outside of what you just said? Like, what are some other things that you see is a common stereotype, like stereotypes I see being perpetuated right now, or like in the 50s about, oh, they're going to rape our white women. And I mean, but that not being a part of necessarily the Lost Cause, but I mean, that's like, if you know the Lost Cause, like we're doing these podcasts on these different films, but you can see it. You can see like, oh, okay, yes, that's a perpetuation of this. It is tying it. Because they're like got 6 main tenets that most people prescribe to.
Well, other than like the blatant racist aspect of it, I mean, like the as far as like the causes of the war are sort of underlined in here, and I mean it's not like they completely leave out the firing on Fort Sumter. That is totally left out of the story. Instead, it's like you got, well, hey, we're the Southern people, and we're just fine and dandy down here, and our slaves are fine and all that. And then all the
slaves are dancing.
Yeah, right. They're dancing around a bonfire and they're having a good time and all that. And but then you get to this card, which is supposed to be a historical facsimile, I think is what it says on there, of Lincoln. Hey, I'm going to send 75,000 troops down to the South because I got to get things in order down there or whatever, But it's weird because they have this scene in there where Lincoln's signing off on this to send the troops down there and all this, the northern aggressor or whatever. But the movie actually portrays Lincoln as being like the good northerner, which is fairly common actually in the Lost Cause, is that, or this idea that, hey, if Lincoln had lived, things wouldn't have been so bad in the Reconstruction. He would have went easy on us, But I mean, that's fairly, but you have that right. I think the movie actually refers to him as the Great Heart. I think that's what it calls him. the great heart. Like, I mean, I like Lincoln a lot, but like, I don't know, like that just it's so melodramatic that that it's just ridiculous. But that Lincoln is the good Northerner, and that the war was completely perpetuated by the North. That it was that the South just, well, we wanted to leave in peace and, you know, just live our lives in our own way and all that. And we know that's not true. You know, we know historically that is not true.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was something else off topic to what you just said, but this is the very first film with an intermission, if I'm not mistaken, because of its length. Like you said, the orchestral score, and that was something else I had remarked on, but that's super interesting. I was like, wow, okay, so this is like that, but they were saying it's like that became more of a tradition after this in cinema, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think the average silent film was probably about 20 minutes.
Yeah, and this was over 3 hours or whatever, like, yeah, three close to 4 hours of film, right? And people hadn't seen a spectacle like this. And right, what's also intriguing is that this is the highest grossing American film prior to Gone with the Wind, right? I mean, that's fascinating.
Well, the thing that kind of blew me away too was the tickets for this movie were so expensive for the time. Yeah. Like adjusting for inflation, it was about $20 for a ticket.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
Like, who was paying to go see this? Yeah,
right. And but reading about sort of like the immersive experience or whatever of this, like apparently what they had ushers dressed as Klan members. Did anybody else read about this? Because I read about it. You know, I was like, yeah, they had ushers, you know, in the hoods and everything, showing people into the theater.
You know, the thing that's crazy for me, and I guess speaks to how powerful movies are, not just that this got the Klan going again, but this is where like the burning crosses came from. This was not a thing before this movie.
Yeah.
Also, the costuming as well. Like the Klan outfits historically did not look like that before this film.
Yeah. And then surprise, right? Art imitating life, life imitating art.
So, you know, this is something, and this may have kind of to do along the lines of censorship, but there is something to be said here, I think. I was thinking this was just kind of going through on both of these, but like particularly with Gone with the Wind, because it's a little more visible. It's easier to see because there's dialogue and you know, the opening sequences and stuff. But it's like, how much does this perpetuation of these myths in these fictions in propaganda influence? Like, we are seeing this public opinion being reinforced on these tenets of the Lost Cause in every aspect, right? Like somebody was bringing up Dukes of Hazzard last night, like, you know, but in culture, like, I was commenting on something, maybe that flag post I'd shared, and they're like, well, the reason that hillbillies probably think that you know, it's popular is because of this, and I was like, actually, I think it's popular because of this. That stuff that I just shared, it says that, yeah, that's what I think. But I was like, but more like the Dukes of Hazzard is a product, like that's just like the doubling down on everything, like, oh yeah, Battle Flag Army, Northern Virginia. It's great. We love it. It's been around for 20 years now in culture. But like, it's like a cause and effect. Like you're saying, like Gone with the Wind's the next highest grossing movie. But it's like, how much are these, the perpetuation of these myths influencing not just like people outside of the South, like public opinion? Like that's something I just kept thinking about. And I get that, like, I feel like if we were influencing public opinion, we would be shushed, you know, but you know, maybe, I don't know, like podcasters get censored all the time, honestly. But like, that's why Joe Rogan has left YouTube, is over censorship, right? He's pulling all of his videos off of YouTube. He's the highest viewed podcast on the whole internet, and he's leaving due to censorship. But it's like, if anybody is influencing public opinion, that guy probably could be. So like, I don't know really what the laws are on that, but
yeah, that's always a fine line with censorship. I mean, you know, if you've ever been on a college campus, you've always seen the crazy preachers with the abortion pictures and yelling at people and stuff. Like, they have a designated space they have to be in to do that the university zones off for free speech, to get around, being able to have them there, and not get sued for telling them they can't use their First Amendment rights. But yeah, like I said, I mean, film is art. So yeah, I don't like Birth of a Nation. I felt awful watching it, and I felt even more awful because I kept laughing out of shock at how like racist it was. But at the same time, like I just don't think it should be totally banned. No one ever watched this ever. I think people need to know, like, hey, someone made this movie and it was racist. And yeah, it's history, it's historical context at this point, but it has to have that context with it so people understand it and it's not used once again to get the Klan going.
Right. I think something that like I've been thinking about with this is that I think it's interesting that a film like this has been around now 105 years, right? But it never sort of received the Song of the South treatment, right?
Yeah,
Where it just like pretty much vanishes. I guess maybe because it's a Disney product, I don't know. Maybe they're a bit, more.
Disney's better at hiding their old shames.
Yeah. So, but that's kind of fascinating to me. And another thing that's kind of fascinated me about The Birth of a Nation is, I mean, of course, it's completely subversive, but how it exposes the racism of our president at that time, Woodrow Wilson. I think that's
quoted in the movie.
Yeah, he's right, but I mean, it's almost like he's quoted in the movie in order for him to be like, oh, hey, I have to rubber stamp this now. I have to say that, hey, this is. Because like his quote was allegedly, like, this has always been debated, right? That it's like history written in lightning, and that my only regret is that it is oh so terribly true, or whatever. Which is like.
Well, he personally knew Dixon, right?
Yeah.
Dixon was his student or something like that. Or he knew him from university setting. So I've always wondered, did he say that? Or I mean, I know he did the screening as a favor to him, knowing him. I'm like, did he say this meaning it? Or did he just invite this guy to show his film and then he was like, oh my God, what have I done?
Well, something to think about. I was thinking about this today. It's like, how long from the time you guys are talking about right now to the time the last slaves are at the White House? Because I was listening to something talking about Jefferson's presidency, and he was like, they were talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition, said how the South won the war book. But they're like, yeah, Jefferson had the White House slaves doing this and that and this. And then I was like, well, I wonder when the last slaves were at the White House. I just had this thought like 2 hours ago. I didn't have a chance to look it up yet, but right. So, but it's like, that's something that's interesting. Like, we're not, that wouldn't be that far removed, 1915. Like, everybody who's alive at that time is going to have like a grandpa that was a former slave.
Yeah.
Maybe a White House slave. I don't know, but it's like that's something fascinating to me, is like how far removed the presidency would be from it. It's like, was there slaves at the White House right before Lincoln? I don't know. I'll have to look it up. I'll do that while we're sitting here.
I think like a thought to piggyback onto that is, they didn't make Birth of a Nation to be like, oh, let's create this lost cause myth. And I mean, DW Griffith, like, he believed in this. The author of this book believed in this. Like, this is something that was around before this movie came out, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, when did the lost cause myth really start, and who was responsible for starting it?
I would say, I mean, I see it starting to become evident by 1890, right? That's like Reconstruction is over. Like, one thing I always point to is that right as Reconstruction was over, our next 6 governors in Arkansas after that were former Confederate officers. And they were undoing, like, so at that time you have everybody basically getting Senate and everything in line. So by 1890, you can start perpetuating Jim Crow.
Yeah, right. No, I think you're completely right with that, Brent. Right. Reconstruction has to end. You have to get rid of the sort of federal oversight, but you also have to get rid of the troop presence too, right? You don't have so then that means pretty much you can run rampant if you're part of a certain secret society. You know, you can do what you want at that point. You don't have to worry about necessarily military intervention of any
Are you talking about Klan or UDC?
Well, maybe both.
You know, the DAR, have you guys looked much into the Daughters of the American Revolution?
No.
Okay. Like, it's still an active chapter over in Dardanelle that still meets, and they designed our state flag, added the 4-star to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm being like, okay, so here's an X, right? And if you go like this, it's a diamond.
Yeah.
But we do have the only diamond mine in North America. But so I could be being conspiratorial about that. But they designed our state flag. The Daughters of the American Revolution designed our state flag. But they also are responsible for flying the stars and bars and putting up that monument. So in Dardanelle, the one we've been chatting about.
Something that's like interesting is that like I've seen pictures of the monument when its current place maybe about 20 years ago, and that flagpole was not there.
Yeah. Did anybody hear back from the mayor?
Right. That's what?
Did you hear back from the mayor, Julie? Didn't you say you emailed him?
I've sent several like, hey, how's it going?
I'm friends with that guy on Facebook. I've thought about hitting him up and being like, hey, Jimmy, what's up? You know me, right? But it's, I do want some acknowledgement on it. I think that just so many people don't know that's what the stars and bars looks like.
Yeah.
Because I'll say, hey, do you know that this flag's flying in Dardanelle? And they'll be like, no, I would have seen that. But they're thinking the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, like when I spotted it, like it just completely I was completely taken aback. And what's weird is that I drive past that almost every day to get to work, and I just happen to be driving through and I look up and I'm like, that's the Confederate stars and bars. Where'd that come from? I'm like, it's still flying? Shouldn't that be like a white flag?
The real flag of the Confederacy.
What do you guys think about I know we haven't had time or haven't talked about this, but the NASCAR banning, right? I think we're messaged about it a little bit, but what are you guys' thoughts on what they're doing with that? I like that we're making those moves, and branches of the military are starting to take on that issue as well.
Right. But who would have thought it would have been NASCAR to take these steps though, right? I mean, that's what's like so surprising about this.
That's a flex.
Yeah, right. That's like Southern redneck heaven, man.
Did you see him? Like that one guy was like, he's like a NASCAR truck racer. I didn't even know that was a thing, but he's like, I'm leaving NASCAR over this. And then NASCAR tweeted, was like, we had to Google who you were. See ya. That was good.
Wow.
But yeah, having NASCAR on our side of like, hey, let's get rid of all these like, loser participation medals. That's a big step. I never would have thought NASCAR would have turned on that.
Okay, so we were messaging about this. This is a great time, I think, that we're seeing all this stuff happen, but the Aunt Jemima thing, right? Like that's another sort of perpetuated stereotype. But man, I like people from my parents' generation are super up in arms, pissed about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's gonna be next? It's a pancake syrup.
Erasing history.
Yeah, I've heard people say, "Oh, where does it stop, though?"
Yeah.
Should it stop?
Equality.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, okay. So not to jump ahead, but this is something I came across that it like really bothered me, honestly, because I saw some people have been sharing things over the Gone with the Wind thing about the character that played Mammy. What was her name? McDaniel?
Hattie McDaniel.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this was in LA in 1940. She was not allowed to go into the auditorium and sit with the other co-stars, and she was given a speech to read that was written by the studio. But people always like to, like, I've seen people in the Aunt Jemima thing being like, well, she was the first black lady to win an Oscar, and, or we're just going to take that away too. Like, I saw something along the lines of that. And I'm like, yeah, but do you know that part? You know, that she was treated that way. Like,
Well, she was allowed in, but
she was allowed in the auditorium, but they like
Yes.
had to like escort her in, right? Or something like that.
they had to get special permission for her to be there, and she had to sit at a table all the way in the back with like her agent and an escort. I don't know anything about what if her speech was written for her, but I do know she was not allowed into the after parties after the ceremony was over, which is terrible.
And that's in LA.
Yeah.
Jeff Woods suggested this book to me today. You guys could maybe look into it too. Sweet Land of Liberty. It deals with segregation, but more like de facto segregation in the North and in the West, which is something I've just like made my rounds in the scholarship on Jim Crow. Now I'm super interested into like, okay, how did this happen outside of the South? Did it worsen because of like films like what we're talking about on doubling down on these stereotypes and things?
Well, I mean, Hattie McDaniel, she's a controversial person anyways, because essentially she is a black actress who played white Hollywood's game. That's how she won her Oscar. And then for the rest of her career, she played mammy type character. And to me, and you know, I get it. Like, she's having to make a living. She's allegedly said like, hey, I can play a maid for $700 a week, or I can be a maid for $7 a week. So I get it. I don't want to fault this woman for doing this, even though a lot of black actors at the time were like, hey, we got to boycott these roles, or otherwise we're never going to get anything. And she played the game. To me, the saddest thing is whenever she died, one of her requests was to be buried in the Hollywood cemetery, and they said no, whites only.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy is how did that exist? Oh, I don't know what state she died in, right? But do you guys know? Was this show? She wanted to be well, that would have been in California. She wanted to be buried in California. So how did that happen? That's what I'm trying to find out. Is like, how did, by what, 1950 or wherever, in a de facto segregation area of the country, that is existing when it's not legislated in the same way? Like, that's been a unique difference that's come up with. And like, just when I'm listening, reading about Jim Crow, they would just say like Northern segregation, but they don't go into it. So like, I've had Marie, who was on my podcast, she's gave me another source, but like, I haven't had time to dive into any of them. But these are just interesting questions. I'm like, okay, well, how did this come about? Like, how did they de facto segregate in California? All right. And like, because I've heard some people be like, well, no, they were more racist towards like Hispanic people, you know, at that time in California. And I'm like, no, not what I'm coming into. Like, so, you know, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting thing to me, though, that it was just de facto, like it wasn't on the books, but it definitely existed in like school, in many institutions. I hadn't heard that about the cemetery, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was bad everywhere. I'm sure, you know, northern states and especially West Coast California like to brag about how, yeah, I mean, they integrated schools a lot earlier than they did in the South, but they still had segregation for a while.
Well, and I think that I think racial tensions escalated when you had like the second Great Migration, when you did have a lot of former slaves leaving the South after Reconstruction. I think that Northern racism kind of skyrocketed during those times because you had them moving and heavily populating cities that had been predominantly white, and that was met with some, like, I guess you could maybe say massive resistance.
Right. No, I think you're right, Brian, especially like that period around the Great Depression, right, where you get the the migration where you get folks who are leaving sort of the more rural sort of sharecropper life of the South and journeying into the cities of the Midwest and the upper North. And right, because then it's not just, I mean, it's not just a racist thing, then it's also an economic thing. You're competing for housing, you're competing for jobs, and right, that helps escalate sort of the tensions that we then later see come sort of to a head in the 50s and sort of the start of the classic civil rights movement. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good point.
Well, yeah, you guys just want to go ahead and kind of transition into Gone with the Wind? Start riffing on that?
I mean, but before we get to that, the only other thing I want to say is that, we're talking about like the Lost Cause myth here. There is another movie that falls in between both The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind that is notable. Now, what's interesting, I mentioned the American Film Institute and their list of the top 100 movies previously. They had a list that they released in 1998, which was supposed to mark the centennial of American cinema. And they actually had Birth of a Nation on that list, right? But in the revised edition in 2008, Birth of a Nation was gone. However, there is another movie that was added to this and placed all the way at number 17. And that's a movie called The General from 1927, which was made by Buster Keaton, the great American comic, the great stone face, right? And it is a Civil War set movie, which is based on a true historical incident, which was called the Great Locomotive Chase. I don't know, have you heard about this, Brian?
Yes, I'm almost positive in Intro to Film, along with just like passing mentions of cinematic history, that this is also brought up. Like, that's not the first time I've heard of this. The train. Yes, I'm charting what you're talking about. I haven't looked into it in a while, but yes.
Right. It's based on an incident that occurred in 1862 where Union soldiers crossed over into enemy lines into Georgia and attempted to steal a locomotive called the General, but were ultimately captured. But it's sort of like a hero story for the North, right? However, Buster Keaton's version flips it. Instead, the hero is a sort of Confederate Allied conductor who goes to take the train back, right, from the Union aggressors who steal it in the first place. But it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know if that was actually Buster Keaton's view or not, because I mean he was a comedy genius. It is a great film. It's funny. It's wonderful in terms of its production and its like sight gags and stuff like that. But like, I didn't know if maybe he did it because he knew that that's what would appeal to audiences at that time. That would be what would sell the film. Not okay, if we make it about the North, people aren't going to go see this because more people are believing or allied with the Lost Cause ideology at this point. But that was just something I thought about, with this film. But it's something that you don't really see brought up in terms of this because no African Americans appear in this movie. So it's not like there's a ton of overt racism or anything, but it's more focused on sort of this idea of the North as aggressor and the South as, sort of
well, like alternate, basically, or fictionalized versions, like what we're saying. But like, this is about the third time I've thought about this. It's not super relevant to what we're saying, but take three films, and one I think we should do in this series would be Django Unchained.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, like you take Tarantino, you take like Inglourious Bastards, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Those have these alternate endings, right, of these historical events. Like, oh, Tarantino's going to change. But, man, that just seems like completely different to me, the way he does it. I have no problems with the way he does that. Like we're with the Tate murders and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I don't know if you guys have seen that. But, like just the way he tells it, it's like, oh yeah, you put some historical stuff in there, but man, this is totally fiction. Like you made a bunch of stuff up, but there's a bunch of history in there. It's like people got super upset with him over his portrayal of Bruce Lee as non-historical, you know? But it's like, are we going to say, okay, well, if you're going to muddy the waters of history, if you're going to say based on a true story or something like that, you know, are you going to have to put a title screen up at the beginning, like a copyright screen of all your films to maintain political correctness in the future? Or are we going to have to pull like a whole bunch of films down to do that too, before we can like put them back out there to kind of stop perpetuating these myths?
Right. Yeah.
I think it seems like a lot of people look to movies now to get
it's
their
weird.
history from.
Well, there's a great quote that I've heard that from a history book that I read that was like, that said something along the lines, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, but that the greatest historians, or the most influential historians of the 20th century, were filmmakers. And I think that that's like a really, you know, that's a pretty bold statement, but I think there is a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, and they carry, that's why it just caught me thinking earlier that it's like there's a lot of influence there. And I think when you deal with historical topics that you might, I've just seen there be paranoia over influencing public opinion with fewer things, like back in the Hollywood era, like when news channels are first coming out and stuff, there were regulations there, so you could not. Like now, I don't see how they could possibly do it. It's like I can live my entire life on social media.
Yeah.
You know, like good luck influencing or you know, censoring that. You know, but there's so many ways to do it now. But I also feel like we're like haven't caught up. I mean, the internet's only been around since '95. We haven't even caught up with like cyber law. Like there's a lot of things I think that are going to change big time with some of this stuff. And I think that we might just be, I remember 10 years ago, Dr. Gleason in one of the classes I had her for talking about some basic thoughts she had about cyber law and how that nothing in that realm had even been touched at that time. Like they were just coming out with like some of the first cyber laws. And I think that will be something that, like I said, mentioning people getting censored on YouTube. We're seeing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But fascinating.
Okay. Well, I guess we can. Well, okay. One more thing, and because Birth of a Nation is an abomination, and I kind of enjoy hating on it.
We didn't even mention the blackface.
Exactly. That's what I was going to get to, right? Was white actors in blackface, right? Which actually make many of these characters appear even more monstrous. And it's so bad because of that, right? I mean, it's like the scientific racism, mutants or whatever, you know, it's terrible. It's awful.
You know, I may be making this up, but I think they did the blackface because there's some scene that have some black actors.
Right, yeah.
It's typically a group of black people, and there's no white actors in the scene. And I think they did that because they did not want black men in the same scene with a white woman.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which is wild and offensive.
Right.
Outrageous.
Yeah, that's wild.
Wow.
Yeah. So what do you guys think about, so one thing that I feel like people gave this guy a pass for years, but they've come for Robert Downey Jr. in Tropical Thunder, and I kind of like it. Right? Like, I mean, that's a case of blackface.
But I'll put Tropic Thunder and Blazing Saddles in the same category. Offensive, but done for comedy, and the people it's making fun of are the racist.
Right. It's not necessarily aimed at black people, but actors who go to stupid lengths in order to portray a character. Yeah. That's kind of how I view it.
And Tropic Thunder even has a black actor to call him out repeatedly on it.
Yeah.
They're very aware of what it is. But yeah, it's just kind of a pot shot at actors in Hollywood. So I give that one a pass for that reason.
That is, I mean, I think we should take into consideration context, right? Like the Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind are seriously dramatic films, right? Like there's a tone to them, right? And I think you lose that with Tropic Thunder, obviously, because you're laughing. But that is an interesting point, that like sort of the comedic value. I hadn't really thought about that.
I mean, Robert Downey Jr. was nominated for an Oscar for that role.
Oh man, and that film's doubly politically incorrect because of Simple Jack.
Yeah. Crossed the line twice.
Oh man, that is too good. So I guess so. Like, would you call Birth of a Nation and The General, like Gone with the Wind, these sort of event films of like the early?
Yeah, historical epic.
Yeah.
I think
they're actually really similar in terms of tone, and even the time period it covers, kind of the plot. It has similar where Birth of a Nation's framed around these two families, and the story is so stupid. Gone with the Wind has a much better story, but tries to have a romance. So yeah, they are very similar in that sense.
Right.
Well, and I think Gone with the Wind was like maybe the first, film that was done that had dialogue, that wasn't a silent film, that was like telling the story of the Civil War. It was The General a silent film or no?
Yeah, no, it was silent. It was a silent film. But I mean, the difference there is that The General's a comedy, right? I mean, these other two films are dramas. They're dramatic narratives, and The General more uses the Civil War as kind of the backdrop, just to tell this kind of comedic narrative story, which Gone with the Wind, of course, it's definitely all drama, but just like Birth of a Nation was in that regard, right?
Well, and I think there's a lot of debate. Like, I think a lot of people assume that Gone with the Wind was originally done in black and white, but it was actually, there had been colored films out for like 4 or 5 years, if I'm not mistaken. Like, well, I looked that up. I was like, was this originally the color? Did they tint it after the fact?
Well, what you're probably referring to is the Technicolor process or whatever. I mean, but color movies have been around almost since the beginning. I mean, a lot of that was like the techniques that they would use, but they'd actually hand paint each individual frame. They actually had groups of people who would do that. And I mean, there's some pretty cool restorations of some earlier silent films like that. If you've ever seen George Méliès's A Trip to the Moon from 1902, there's a really, really neat color version of that. But that's a whole different discussion there. We're talking about science fiction films. But no, I mean, right. This comes out Gone with the Wind comes out in 1939, right? Which is also the same year that The Wizard of Oz comes out, which is notable for its use of Technicolor, right? It starts out black and white, and then once Dorothy ends up in Oz, suddenly, you're into full-on color splendor at that point. But the spectacle of Gone with the Wind is similar sort of with the spectacle of The Birth of a Nation, right? Nobody had seen something of this scope before, which I think Gone with the Wind, right, it's a big movie.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning the book came out in 1936, and it was a huge bestseller. It was like second to the Bible. So it's coming in off of this huge best-selling novel, whereas Birth of a Nation's based off a book, and I guess it was kind of a hit, but not to the level that is Gone with the Wind, the book. And having read the book myself, the movie actually tones down a lot of the Lost Cause rhetoric, right, and a lot of the racism.
So when did you read the book, Julie?
I read the book in 3rd grade because I was weird. But I did a reread as an adult when I was in grad school. So yeah, when I was in 3rd grade, I didn't understand any of it, but...
What ways do you see it being toned down?
So some changes in the book. They use the N-bomb a lot. Also, the scene where Scarlett's second husband is killed after first she gets accosted in Shantytown. In the book, it is very clearly the men are trying to rape her, and it is specifically a black man. The movie switched it where it was the white man and the black man's dealing with the horse. So they toned down that. But yeah, when they attack Shantytown, the political rally they're going to is a KKK meeting. And the KKK, like, they join up with them and out Shantytown, and KKK is shown as being these heroes who help this white woman being attacked by a black man. There's that. There's a lot more about kind of romanticizing the South. Ashley Wilkes is pretty much a stand-in for the Old South and being a Southern gentleman, which you kind of get in the movie, but I also think he's incredibly miscast, so you don't get as much of it.
Right. As an aside, I want to say that's actually kind of a shame, because Leslie Howard was not a bad actor by any means, but yeah, he was just miscast. I mean, it's obvious the guy's English. He doesn't even really attempt an accent.
Yeah, he has no Southern accent. I mean, he did the movie so he could produce another film. So he knew he was miscast. But also what's interesting too, and this is kind of like an aside thing, is that Leslie Howard died. He was shot down by German fighters, like in 1943 or whatever, on a passenger plane. But they actually believe that Winston Churchill, I think, was on board the plane. What?
Yeah.
I've never heard that part of it. I knew.
Really? Yeah, no, but back to, I mean, this was like when I was rewatching it, and this is probably the first time I've seen it, well, or in 10 years or something like that, and I mean, even, I was back in my 20s then, but still, it was like I had to text you and I had to be like, okay, political rally, does that mean like a Klan raid, and you're like, yes,
Yeah, it's clearly stated.
Yeah, I was like, how did I miss this before? I mean, it's obvious, right? Well, why would the military be there?
The movie tones it down.
They're trying to stop domestic terrorism,
It's the same with how they portray the slaves. I mean, the book does it as well. It's like, oh, we treated them well. There's like one line where Ashley Wilkes is like, we treated them well and I would have freed them anyway. I'm like,
yeah, right.
Slavery, one line in your movie about the Civil War?
Yeah.
Did they any mention in the book? It's like, I haven't read the book. Now I'm interested in maybe trying to do it on Audible or something. But is there any portrayal about the horrors of the institution?
No.
That is, I mean, I can get like portraying like, okay, well, these are the house servants. These are the only ones you see. But like on the film, like when you see them, like they're like, I say when it's quitting time in the field, that. It's like, man, I bet they were just out there singing songs right before this, probably just having a great old time, right? They appear to be in a good mood. It's the end of the day, But
one of the first shots of the movie is like six slaves in a field, and they look like they're having a great time.
Well, and it also almost suggests that they're like autonomous too, right? That we call the shots here. We're working for ourselves. Quitting time. It's like you don't stop being a slave, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous.
I was thinking too, I was like, who all were the black characters in the movie? You have Mammy. She doesn't leave, her only role in the film is to take care of Miss Scarlett. That's all she does. Prissy is incompetent and annoying, unless you take the alternate character interpretation that she was actively trying to kill them by being incompetent. But I don't think that's what the movie was trying to do. Pork, who is slow and seems somewhat lazy, and then the only other one is really Big Sam, who is to save Scarlett and then sound excited about digging ditches for the Confederate soldiers.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah. Oh, we're gonna go dig for the white man to lay in. I was like, what? Yeah, but well, so like what I was wondering, and I want to look up on Atlanta, whether or not you had slaves trying to flee to Union forces, or you had, because I mean, the, some slaves were used in that same regard. I want to say I was reading about it in my history book I used for my US1 class about how they found some slaves that were being trained to help the Confederate Army, not as soldiers, but to do like in soldiering tactics, like trench digging and things like that. Which, because I had some student in one of my classes just recently be like, "Well, you know, I'm pretty sure that slaves fought for the South. Like, did they had them to fight for the South?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, no, let's look into that."
No. Well, that's a more recent contingent of this lost cause myth, right? That you had black Confederate soldiers, and that's simply not true. Because even if you threw the ideal out there, right? Hey, let's give the slaves guns and be like, hey, they can fight for us and then they can have their freedom, right? It's that wasn't going to go over with the high command. That wasn't going to go over with the elites, the planter class. They weren't going to have that. Notably, right, the one guy in the Confederacy who first offers this, and this is toward the end of the war, right, when they're hurting for people at this point, was General Patrick Cleburne, who was an Irishman, and he lived here in Arkansas, and he fought in the Army of the Tennessee, and he came up with the idea. He wrote this letter, that's like, hey, maybe we should do this, and he was ostracized because of it. But the idea that, right, that there were black Confederate soldiers is not true. If anything, right, the slaves would have been used, like you said, Brian, they would have been used more for menial tasks, right? Digging ditches, entrenchments,
building the White House.
Yeah, yeah, right. But there's no real historical basis for this, but you still see it.
Yeah, when that was just perpetuated in my US1 class last semester. I was just telling you also about the seems to be I'm trying to figure out and get up on how and why people are also trying to deify Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Oh man.
Okay.
Are we going to have one on Ken Burns' The Civil War? Because I just want to throw Shelby Foote under the bus.
I thought about this on my way home from my office today, was driving. What if we save that for the very end? Because it's so big. Because I looked around. I can't find another good, like if we wanted to do a pairing like what we're doing with this and other episodes we talked about. But if you could find something, I'm down to do some comparing and contrasting.
I think that's spectacular. And I think it works too because it's a documentary. It's supposed to be history. It's supposed to be history presented it's supposed to be factual, right? For the most part, even though you have the Lost Cause mythos showing up all throughout, but no, I think that's great. I just kind of like the opportunity because Shelby Foote gets so much airtime for Civil War stuff. And I mean, if you see him on film, he's a likable guy. He tells a lot of humorous and insightful anecdotes, but not a very good historian.
Bro, you were kind of the person that brought that to my attention. I'm not even gonna lie. You because I hadn't seen that documentary in years, and I'd watched the first part a couple of times, and I've gotten super interested. And I'm going through, watched a few episodes recently, but I and also started watching it recently just because you had made a post on Facebook, and I was like, I thought this was great. I thought and then now I'm more aware of
right. Well, there's I mean, and I think this would be really neat if they went back and perhaps sort of redid this or made an updated sort of version of this, right, to combat some of these claims and whatnot. But I mean, I think that would be really fascinating. But right, and I mean, spoiler alert, if we're going to talk about this later with the Civil War, right, Shelby Foote makes the statement, I believe, that the Civil War produced two geniuses, the first one being Abraham Lincoln and the second one being Nathan Bedford Forrest. And, you know, if you know about the Fort Pillow massacre, and just, I mean, the guy was one of the founders of the Klan. I mean, it's just, you know, it's so bad. And he's also got a crazy looking statue that was put up, maybe like a couple of years ago or whatever. Right. But
Well, yeah, I had that same. I don't remember if I mentioned. Did I tell you? I can't remember if this was this podcast or last podcast. I was talking about systemic racism right before this, but yeah, the Nathan Bedford Forrest thing, I still can't understand that, because as somebody that I like respect somewhat recently, an older person in my life, they were like, I don't even believe racism exists, and I was like. This other person I love, he wrote 2 books on it, you know, like I was just like, you know, just trying to understand it. And I was like, but you have this. And then like I was actually having a conversation with him about the Irish slave Smith thing, because he had shared it. And this guy's like in his 70s. Right. And he was like, well, you know, the Klan, when they first started. And I was like, whoa, I don't even want to hear what you're about to say. Like, because he was basically going to be like, well, the Klan's not that bad. And he even did go on to say some of that stuff. And like, where does that even come from?
right. Well, this is actually mentioned in Ken Burns' A Civil War documentary. And it's, I don't know if it's like somewhat of a way of like absolving Nathan Bedford Forrest of some of his prior sins or whatever. But it's like, well, even though he founded the Klan, he later left it because it just became just too violent for him. You know, and I'm like, this is the guy who ordered the murder of like 200 captured African-American Union troops. You know, it's ridiculous. This is the guy who Shelby Foote's talking about. Well, you know, he had 15 horses shot out from under him, and he grabbed a Union guy and was using him as a human shield, and, you know, while shooting other people. And it's like, you know, too violent, you know, for real?
I feel like too, if you found something and it becomes too violent, it's your responsibility to shut it down and not just walk away.
Yeah, right. You created this monster. Deal with it. Yeah, you know. So, well, I'm going to go and retire to my plantation and money. And I mean, and I know I'm hating on Forrest, but he deserves it. He deserves it because he's made out to be this rugged individualist, but he wasn't. He was a rich guy. He made his money prior to the Civil War. He owned land. He owned slaves. He's part of the planter class. He's part of the problem.
So like we're, you know, with Lee, like I kind of got down onto this in some readings, but it's just like Lee became, because of what you're saying and because of what Alexander Stevens said about the Confederacy being built on
the speech.
Well,
yeah.
And then Jeff Davis, but like basically they're like, man, those guys were so on the record with like their white supremacy that we can't really make a big deal about them. But it's really interesting to me the ways in which they were able to pass Lee off in the mythos, you know, like I mentioned with Gettysburg, which I actually do like that film too. Like I've seen it several times. It came out when I was a little kid, right? But it does, like, I'm like, man, General Longstreet. When I rewatched it as an adult, I was like, I don't remember any of the Union stuff except for Chamberlain and the little round top, which was a cool sequence.
Inspiring.
But,
yeah,
it was. But like all I remember is Longstreet and, you know, Martin Sheen is General Lee, and how much like, man, like that film really does, I feel like, kind of go over the top. But it's like, that's, you know, 93, I think, when that's come out. But that's a you know, almost 100-year process of like building him up, building a guy that put salt in the open wounds of the slaves that he personally beat. Like, how was they able to make him look positive?
This is part of Lost Cause. Like the entire Southern men are just portrayed as being this upper class of men that had these values, and they were gentlemen, and they had a code they lived by. You see that in Gone with the Wind, and the opening like scroll. It's talking about, you know, the days of gentlemen, and even the movie seems to think that's the reason that the South, they would win this war, just because of who they are, and they had these codes and virtues. And somehow they left out, the slavery part of it and the brutal treatment of other humans.
Right. And getting back to Gone with the Wind, talking about it, this is another film that makes the thing where they leave out Fort Sumter, right? There's no mention of it in the film. Instead, Lincoln's sending down the troops. Everybody go enlist. The war's here. That sort of thing. And it's like, come on. That was crucial.
Yeah, that's the on the Northern aggression. Like here, building on what Julie just said. Here's a quote from the beginning sequence, right? Which it refers to like the Old South as the end of a civilization, right? But here was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever be seen the knights and their ladies fair of master and slave. Look for it now only in the books, for it is but a dream to be remembered. Wow.
I was going to say that I thought Gone with the Wind really toned down the Lost Cause rhetoric, but that plays it up pretty well.
That was that was literally the opening sequence. Like it's giving you the text, and I was like, all right, here we are back in the saddle watching it again. Because like Cora and I watched it like early on when we were together, and she doesn't even remember us watching it, right? But like I'd seen it, like my sister and mom watched it several times when I was growing up, right? When I was probably that age that Julie was reading it. But and there's some things I remember, like the Prissy character. Damn, I remember her. Like she really got on my nerves with her voice and like screaming and stuff, like whining and getting slapped. Like I remembered a bunch of stuff from her character for some reason from when I was a kid. I don't know. I don't really know why. But she was just the one that stuck out the most to me. But that's I thought, I'm interested too, that just like what Julie said, it's got me super interested to compare the book to the movie now. I have a lot of times, like my students for their paper, I'll be like, look, you're going to write about this film that was quote unquote based on a true story, or a historical film, because you always lose things. And like we're talking about historical fiction essentially, right? Fictionalized films. But like there's plenty of films out there that are like they will take that creative liberty and then they still throw hey, this is based on real events, true story, based on a true story. So like I think that's like that why I was super interested to do these episodes with you guys is I already am super interested in the topic of how history gets into film and how it muddies the waters. And I never really even thought about it until we had this whole narrative going around the Lost Cause. I don't even remember how it came up, but I'm glad we're getting to do it because, man, I love film classes. I took 2 film classes in college. And if there would have been an option to do more, like I never got to take Moses for American History through film. Did you take that?
No, I didn't. No.
He taught that when I was in undergrad or grad school, and I never got a chance, but that would have been a great one. But man, that is just such an interesting topic to me, history and film, and how you lose so much, like, or whether it's inserting these propaganda statements or what.
Well, it's crazy too when you realize how much Gone with the Wind has influenced everyone's ideas of like the Reconstruction era.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Like watching it and I'm like, I feel like everything I know about this, I know from Gone with the Wind, and I know it's not true.
Yeah, it makes you doubt everything at that point, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I had to act like, what did I learn about the Civil War in grade school? About Southern Bells. That's all I remember.
Right. Well, what I was going to mention is I feel in a lot of ways the textbooks that we read in grade school in a lot of ways mirrored sort of this portrayal that we see in Gone with the Wind, the Old South, the gallantry, the chivalry, right?
Mm-hmm.
The virtuousness. Yeah.
So do you guys think that we were taught any of that when we were kids? Like, I mean, because I don't know, because I don't have any of my textbooks. You know what I'm saying? Like, I've been like, I want to read like my 8th grade textbook, because I actually didn't come to public school until 8th grade, right? So, but I want to read and just be like, what narrative was I being told? Because like, I'm not even gonna lie, I wasn't paying attention very much at that time. It was like my first year in public school, you know. So, like, I didn't even like know how to be in a learning environment. Was like just like trying to figure out everything that's going on. I like wish I would have paid more attention to like Coach Cal's U.S. history class.
I'll say that as far as I'm aware, like, I mean, I'm a historian, and my first love in history was the American Civil War, right? That's what got me into this whole thing. And I was like probably like 8 or 9 years old, you know. But it's like even then, I feel like what I read, what I learned in school, you could back then you could easily go and find Civil War magazines and stuff. But that the Lost Cause narrative was all part of this. That even amongst historians in the 90s.
Yes, 90s.
Right. You had this great resurgence of this Lost Cause myth. And I mean, I believed it, you know, or I'll admit it. You know, it's sort of like you were telling me in the last podcast we had how you went down to the Johnson County Courthouse during Peach Festival and you're like, hey, look at this cool Confederate flag hat, right? You know, you don't think it's wrong, right? And it's like, I felt sort of the same way. You know, I felt because I was in a way almost indoctrinated into this idea that, hey, maybe the South did fight for states' rights. Maybe it wasn't about slavery. You know, maybe it's the victors who've painted out these guys to be bad when they actually weren't, you know, but.
To go back to the one line about slavery in Gone with the Wind, Ashley Wilkes saying, "Ooh, I would have freed them anyways."
Yeah.
I'm like, I feel like that's part of the Lost Cause. Is like, oh, we were fighting for states' rights. We would have freed them anyways. Like,
Yeah.
no, they were the backbone of your economic system. There's no way you're gonna free slaves.
Right, and I know it's hard for people to deal with the fact that, you know, their relatives or whatever who may have been good, nice people or whatever fought for the wrong side. They were on the wrong side of history, and I think that you know that's hard for people to understand. But and they'll throw out arguments like, well, we didn't own slaves. You know, it was yeah, we were poor. We didn't own slaves, but it's like you were still benefiting from the structure of slavery because it was ingrained in every facet of the Southern experience, Southern life. If you were white, you benefited from that in some fashion.
Did you, or were you referencing that? I saw a video today, Thurman, where it was like it was at one of these statues and you had this guy with a Confederate flag, like an overweight guy, and he was like, you know, he's like, oh, my slave was for, you know how much you guys cost back then? Like, basically what he said, I was like, oh my God.
But that was the part that was cut too, right? Wasn't that what it was? Because it was like initially it was like because the black guy was like, he said something like who was working your farm, right? You know?
We couldn't afford y'all.
Yeah. You know how much a slave cost? And it's like, oh. Yeah.
Oh man. Hey, I'm gonna plug in my Mac real quick. I didn't plug it in before we started. My battery's down. I'll be right back.
But yeah, I think it's hard for people to accept the fact that their relatives were on the wrong side of history. And that, I mean, some of them may have been duped. I think it's possible. I mean, it depends on what you think the causes or who was necessitating or creating the conflict of the Civil War. If you think it was the planter class, which were the ones, of course, who had the most invested in this, in the institution of slavery. If they're the one who create and cultivate this idea that we need to go to war, we need to fight. But I think that's in kind of part of it, I think.
To me, it's comparable to, Germany in World War too. Like they weren't all Nazis, but they definitely all fought for Germany, and they all get to share in the collective guilt of being on the wrong side.
Right.
And for some reason, the Confederacy and all the ancestors of Confederate soldiers do not want to share in any of that guilt, and instead want to point fingers and be like, oh, well, the North, they didn't care about freeing slaves. They just wanted to I don't know, fight the South, or all these other reasons. And then coming up with, the Confederate soldier was this great man. I mean, you've read all the inscriptions on the monuments about how great our Confederate soldiers were. It's like, at what point are we going to stop and say, they made a mistake, let's move on?
Yeah, well, this is right. And then you take down the statues, you're erasing history or whatever, right? Like we're all going to have collective amnesia and suddenly forget about the Civil War. Like, oh, what was that happened? No, that's not going to happen. But I just don't understand the idea behind the statues, right? You're erasing history, but the statues themselves are a fabrication. They're a created history. They're a story. They're not history. A story. A myth, right? I mean, that is not history. I'm sorry, guys. I get worked up over
I do too. I'm just glad I can talk to you guys about this, because most of the people I talk to, it's not a conversation like this, right? It's like me trying to be like, hey, you know that you're perpetuating a lie right now with this and that. So it's all the conversations I've had about this have been like not an engaging discussion. It's been like, well, did you know? I mean, with some people, like Hausnick actually started a Change.org petition to get the Confederate Mothers Park, to get the monuments removed there, tag the mayor and stuff in it, right?
Okay.
So, but then I was going to talk to you guys about this. In Johnson County, in the Oakland Cemetery where my grandpa's buried, there's a Confederate monument there.
Yeah,
right?
we've been there. We actually went out there, about a year and a half ago to look at it, I think. Julie and I did. And, but right, I mean, do you think that's the proper place for that monument? I mean, it's in a cemetery.
With and I haven't seen the monuments at the Confederate Mothers Park here, but they're monuments, not statues. As far as I understand, the monuments here in Russellville are to commemorate the actual mothers of veterans that died. There's not like a lot of, I haven't seen the rhetoric or anything. And then it's like, oh, you have a monument for dead people who fought in a war in a cemetery. Like those two are less controversial for me. Some of the other ones we talked about across the state, but still, like, that's why I was surprised that I saw somebody being like, yeah, we need this shit gone. And I was like, well, okay, yeah, right on. Yeah, we do. But I hadn't seen people take issue with that park. It's just like a park with some trails and I think like 3 little monuments, but they're just a couple of monuments, some engravings on them. They're not statues. The statues seem to be the hot button for the vast majority of people.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, the one that's in the Oakland Cemetery in Clarksville is, I mean, it's an obelisk, but it's relatively modest. I mean, it's not a garish monument to the brave Southern soldier. It's not
facing north.
Right. Facing the aggressor. Right. Yeah. Like some of the other examples that we've seen in the state. So, but.
The one that gets me the most is that Fort Smith one. Was originally in a cemetery, gets knocked down by a tornado. Government sends a replacement, and they're like, well, this isn't good enough. I need a Confederate soldier. I need rebel flags. We need a poem on it.
I like your accent.
Oh, thanks. That's my United Daughters of the Confederacy accent. But then the government's like, well, you can't put stuff on there. And they're like, well, guess what? We're going to put it right in front of our courthouse. Like
Mississippi putting the Lee flag on their state flag. Like, oh, you want us to integrate? Like, that just blows my mind. And that 5 different states did that, right? They inserted those symbols. And this is late. Like, this is going into desegregation. That's starting to take place. fascinating. I can't remember what year Mississippi did that, but I want to say it was in the 50s. I could be wrong. But man, that is like 5 different states. We're like, oh, while we're erecting these monuments, let's go ahead and do that too. We make our state flag, not just fly the old flag. Like, we're going to make it a part of our state's history.
Yeah, we've incorporated racism into our local governments and into our towns, our flags, and people wonder why racism is still a problem.
Or deny it even exists.
Or
Yeah.
deny it's systemic. Like, people deny that it's like, that's one thing I picked up. It's not systemic. Our institutions. Well, it's like, that's what's fascinating me about the de facto segregation in the North and West. It's like, oh, it didn't even have to be legislated. How about that? Right. So here's something that kind of a stereotype that was brought up in Gone with the Wind that was kind of concerning to me. You know how those Wilkes marry their own cousins, right? I was like, oh, I forgot that part. But they like perpetuated that stereotype, which I maybe it's not a stereotype. How did that make it in? It's like, no, he's not going to marry you. He's going to marry his cousin. Okay.
Yeah, they do say the Wilkes always marry their cousins. And then, Ashley's like a very weak.
Yeah.
And
Right. He doesn't have a spine.
I was thinking like, and this is kind of a totally different topic, but pretty much all the men, except for Rhett Butler, are emasculated and don't know what they're doing. It's an interesting gender studies of Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, that is interesting. Rhett Butler is a rugged character, though. Like, I was remarking on that when I was watching it, and his hair looked great. Like, I'm like, how are you in jail right now? And your hair looks that.
He's always got like the gel.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I read a bunch of articles about Gone with the Wind, and one thing I found fascinating is another Black woman who won an Oscar in 1990. Is not pro censoring this film, which would be Whoopi Goldberg, right? She had made some statements on The View one time, was arguing with Queen Latifah about it, apparently, that it's censorship, right? And that, but then you have this other camp that's really arguing, like the guy that originally kind of started the call to take the film down, is that we just need some historical context here and we'll be fine. Whereas the second Black woman to win an Oscar is worried about it and thinks it's going to, where are we going to stop there? It's going to dismantle the positive parts of history. So that was kind of interesting to me that, you would have that. One person like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Like, I was trying to see what people of color kind of commented on this, right? And just kind of compare it. But interesting perspectives. What do you guys think about that?
I liked the adding context. Because, I hate to say it, like Gone with the Wind is such a well-made film. Like, it was groundbreaking. I can see why it's included and list of the best movies ever made. And I think having the context of like, this is not a good representation of what it was like for Black people. This is not a good representation of what the North was like. Maybe even recategorizing it as a fantasy film, because it has a historical backdrop, but it is not very good at sticking to history. And I believe the man who his comment was, hey, add context to it, was the screenwriter for 12 Years a Slave, which is a great movie and is an amazing film if you want like the Black slave perspective. So I'm like, if you're looking for something more historical, watch 12 Years a Slave. If you just want to watch a good movie, great scenes, great filmmaking, check out Gone with the Wind. But, like I said, an asterisk of, hey, this is what was going on and this is Lost Cause rhetoric.
Okay, here's an interesting question, right? Do you think that Birth of a Nation helped the Lost Cause myth?
I would say it definitely got the ball rolling on the perpetuation. Like, I want to go back and look more. Like, I've like heard of the film that you're talking about, or I think I I've either seen clips of that film or I've heard the actual story. Like I got to go back and look into like the general. But that's like interesting that that's kind of the filler, bridge the gap between Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind for me. Like I want to go get some more context. But I would say that, like, I mean, when I was like reading and looking into this, watching the films, is that Gone with the Wind seems to be the next big thing to come up after Birth of a Nation, involving the Civil War. That was like, maybe you mentioned other ones more of a comedy, but that were, you know, a pretty serious tone to them. And I think that it definitely opened maybe a Pandora's box.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Because then the next question would be: do you think that Gone with the Wind was more influential to the Lost Cause myth than Birth of a Nation was? And I would say yes. And that's because it's more digestible.
Birth of a Nation is so racist that you're like, especially in this day and age, you're like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Gone with the Wind is so well made, and like overall a story of survival. Like there's other things that are really good in it that you're like, oh, this is a good film, and kind of just digesting all these lies from about history that actually happened. So yeah, in a way, Gone with the Wind has had a much bigger impact on how people view the Civil War and Reconstruction.
And it's also the question of, do you think that sort of the watering down of sort of the Lost Cause into this more palatable form in Gone with the Wind, is that intentional? Or are the people writing this stuff fooled themselves? Or are they intentionally trying to get this point of view across?
That's why I think like the Lost Cause was already a believable story at this time when they're making this. I do know Gone with the Wind, they're trying to tone down parts of it to make it more digestible for, at the time, what was a modern audience, by taking out the more racist parts of the book. But I think they actually believed in most of this because this is what they've been taught in schools. By this time, like United Daughters Confederacy are already putting this history in schools. So I don't think it was a deliberate like, oh, well, let's further the cause of the South. I think they just thought that this was how it was.
Right. I agree with that sentiment. And one thing that I did think of was, okay, well, maybe one of the reasons that they also dumbed this down was to get more people to come to the theater and see it. But then you realize how much money Birth of a Nation made. You know, it's like there's no point for it then, right? So it's like they had to probably believe that this was factual. This is how the antebellum post-antebellum South actually was, you know.
One thing's interesting you mentioned earlier, Thurman, is that like the 10-year window and Birth of the Nation goes off the list, but this other film goes on the list. And, you know, maybe we're just seeing waves of that, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we became more conscious of Birth of a Nation as propaganda and controversial and perpetuation. And then that it's a model as we move forward. And it's like you become aware, like, this is not super relevant, but I thought about historical manipulation, just making comments on public opinion. But this happens. Like I wrote my master's thesis on the history of martial arts, and like short story why is because you know who writes the history of martial arts? A bunch of non-historians that practice martial arts. Mm-hmm. So there's an inherent bias there that you get from these practitioners. Makes a lot of sense. So I was like, okay, well, you know, I do. And two, I think about it all the time. Like, how can I not be biased since I own a martial arts academy and all this stuff? But they're in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, for example, they manipulated the heck out of that history. Mm-hmm. They did it with judo before that. And I hit on that in my thesis a little bit, but there's this one thing that it came to our attention that was false. Like Woods and I were talking about. I was like, dude, look at this, man. Because I asked him what he thought about historical manipulation in martial arts. And he's like, what do you mean? And I was like, when he's like, and I mentioned Disdain, he's like, well, what about this guy? And I was like, bro, that's what I'm talking about. This guy right here that you just mentioned, that's made up and we were fooled, right? They're saying right now that guy never was associated with any of this and that is a falsity. And I was like, and we're two historians and you're one that I respect like more than any other historian I know maybe. And we were duped just because of how it was presented, right? And it was presented to us in a way where like, maybe like you love film, that's not, but like, okay, we love martial arts. We practice this martial art. This guy that we know that's not a historian, he told us about this, and we're like, okay. And you know, so like I wonder if there's like a filter where like you just use methods of, okay, well maybe a Birth of a Nation was bogus, was perpetuating these ideas. Maybe, well, what else is? It's like it teaches you to kind of think critically in that narrative, and just going through all this lost cause stuff, man. I'm seeing it everywhere.
Yeah. No, it's the lost cause is completely ingrained in some form in how the Civil War is told. I mean, overall, in general, there are elements that are in there, and it's gonna probably take another 200 years in order to try to set the record straight on that and base things on actual empirical historical evidence. But yeah, I mean, the lost cause for a lot of people is the story of the Civil War, the states' rights thing. I mean, there's that shocking statistic or whatever, that nearly half of the American populace believe that the Civil War was fought solely over states' rights.
States' rights to do what?
Exactly. Own slaves. Yes. Thank you.
Do you like, if you go, if we were to go back to the actual Civil War and ask Confederate soldiers what they were fighting for, do you think they would say, I'm fighting to keep my slaves? Or do you think it would be the same, like, oh, states' rights? And then we'd be like, states' rights to what?
There's this great scene in Gettysburg, which is like the only part where there's like any mention of like any sort of Confederate thing, where it's like Joshua Chamberlain's brother, right? He's talking to these like captured Confederate prisoners, right? And he's like, hey, this is kind of what we're fighting for. What are you fighting for, Reb? And he's like, fighting for my rights. My rights.
I remember hearing that. That southern accent was so thick, it sounded like he said rats. I was like, did he say rats?
Yeah, man. But yeah, it's like, and I know Brian and I, we've talked about this, but right, it's like, yeah, what would they say? What was the cause? And it's sort of like what I was getting at earlier, where it's, I feel mostly was probably the planter class are the ones who are responsible for the conflict, right? Because they're the ones who have the most invested in the slavery institution. Not to say that, I mean, like I said, everybody in the South who's white is benefiting from the system of chattel slavery, but that the planter class, the ones with the political power, the economic power, they're the ones who have the most to lose. And they're willing to bet not only black lives, but white lives in order to secure that. And that just shows the lengths that, they were willing to go for to protect this terrible institution.
That's something that's come up. I was texting Thurman about it. It's like, how do you address this? And like, I was joking, like you text me a pretty long reply, and I was just like, I was reading, I was like, like, it was just like confirming all of my thoughts on it, because I mean, that is fascinating to think about. Like, I was asking Thurman, I was like, what is it? Rich Man's War? Like, how did they able to mobilize it? And that's something that people bring up. Well, you think the average Confederate soldier was out there fighting to preserve slavery? And like, I've come across that with a couple of people I've engaged with, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's kind of an unfortunate part about it too. I mean, like Thurman said on this podcast, is like, yes, slavery touched every life way in the South, really. But it is that is something that, man, I've got to place I got to talk to the Black again. Like, I haven't talked to him since March or April. But man, him and Dr. Jones both would be great to just try and drum up something with, whether it be a podcast or what have you. But I haven't talked to the Black since I've been down this Civil War rabbit hole the last 6 weeks. Right. And man, he's the guy to talk to. He was teaching that class at Hendrix when the pandemic started.
Right. Well, you know, like we go into rationalizations for why people fought or whatever. And this is like what I think I mentioned in the text message, is that people were in the South, well, the planter class were terrified that the North that the abolition movement was going to grow out of control, because you had the John Brown raid, which happened in 1859, right on Harper's Ferry. And that these people were scared that rabid abolitionists would come down and start these slave revolts, and that people would be hacked to death, you know, that this would happen. And so that's why they start drumming up, you know, well, hey, this is about states' rights. No, they're trying to protect their investment, because they know the writings on the wall. Slavery is going to go out.
I
Sorry,
read
guys.
about
I
like
get
slavery being part of the social, you know, not just economical, but it was a social thing, and people wanted to own slaves like you would want to buy a house nowadays.
Social mobility, the sign
right.
of
Yeah, it's a status thing. Yeah, exactly. Right. Class. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically the guy at the statue, my family worked their whole life to try and afford slaves that they never could. like that was okay, so you know, like Thurman, I've been talking about the American dream and what that is and maybe how it's changed. But it's like think about that. At one point in the South, that was probably associated with like, oh, you see this planter over here? Like that's the aristocracy. That's the highest, you know, in social mobility. That's the highest rung on the ladder. That's what, you know, and maybe tons of people didn't aspire to that, but everybody's trying to climb the ladder in some way, I feel like.
Well, I mean, if you know, you mentioned that's totally right. That just undermines that guy's complete argument at that point, right? I mean, you know, right, because he's talking about slavery as being, yeah, it's a status thing. You know, you own a slave, you're somebody, and it's like, then that proves that slavery is part of your system, is part of the Southern system, and that it did touch your life in some way, right?
Yeah, you know, I've just been describing it this way, and like just reading some of the rhetoric by Alexander Stevens, Jefferson Davis, and others, it's like, oh yes, okay, so yeah, the South was built on the idea of, or the Confederacy rather, not the holistic South, but the Confederacy came together upon the idea of what you could only call white supremacy.
Right.
Like you read what they say when they're forming and how it's mentioned. I mean, over 80 mentions in the secession letter. Slavery's mentioned in every secession letter. And I mean, the rhetoric's strong in some of them, right?
Right. Right. No. Oh, go ahead.
Do you think they thought, because part of the Lost Cause rhetoric is that they treated their slaves like family. They were a part of the family. They treated them well. And then, you know, we talk about stuff like Robert E. Lee pouring salt in their wounds after whipping them. And do you think they actually thought that, or is that something that developed after?
I don't know. What do you think there?
Well, rephrase that again. What?
Do you think the Confederacy, the citizens of the Confederacy thought they were treating their slaves well?
I think that's a really fascinating question. You know, that's something that I honestly had kind of slipped on and hadn't thought about. I think if like you have the cornerstone idea, right, that this crazy idea that, you know, that blacks are subservient to whites and that we should build a whole society based on this, then yeah, I would say some people actually believe that, yeah, hey, we're treating them great because they view them as almost subhuman, right? They're not on, it's the scientific racism thing. They're not on the same level as us, right? So yeah, we're treating them good. It's like Lee, right? With owning slaves. Hey, I'm offering them a window to Christianity, right? You know,
I've seen that perpetuated a lot.
Yeah. You know, and I mean, it's not just with slavery. I mean, this is also an idea that underruns all of like the imperialism stuff too, on a wider global scale. You know, hey, we're bringing people technology, but we're also saving their souls. You know, that sort of thing like that. But that I do think that probably, even though, the conditions were awful, that they thought that they were actually helping these people from a lesser existence.
Yeah, helping them achieve civilization.
Yeah, what a civilization that is built on a terrible racial lie.
Man, that Richardson, the author of that Old South book I keep mentioning, she, in the very first chapter of the book, goes into when it became racial, right? It's like, and why it became racial, which I'd gotten onto that like previously. Is just basically like, hey, who could we not have a hard time tracking down? Like, oh, well, you look totally different. African slaves, they're a different color. They're going to be easy for us to police. They're going to be easy for us to track down if they run away. They look different. Boom, we're going to stick them over here in this corner of society, and we will civilize them over time. But that was something I'd never really thought about. Like, okay, well, you're going to be a slave because like you're black, and then the transition to that and like the whys behind it, and then the things that went in place. Like, well, like the scientific argument and other things, right? Well, you're just, beneath.
Yeah. Right.
They went through like a lot of like philosophical gymnastics to come up with how black people were somehow below white people, including doing these weird scientific experiments to be like, oh, well, their brains aren't like ours. And
that comes up in Django.
Phrenology.
They seem to be closer related to monkeys than we are. And now, like, looking back on, and even like getting into the whole thing of like, black women are like over sexualized, and then they're going after our white men, which was total opposite. I'm like, this is a lot of lies. And like I said, philosophical gymnastics to come up with all of this. But people believe this for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I know I've been engaging online with some world-class gymnasts. I'll tell you that. It's wild. Digital Olympics. Anyway. That's the greatest way I've heard it described too. It's like to perpetuate and buy into a lot of these things that we've talked about today, you got to jump some hoops in your mind. Like, and the hoops that I jump are like more like what I was saying with Woods, like he's trying to figure out racism, writes 2 books about it in the process, right? Trying to figure out what it means, why it is. And it's like, we're going through the same process, right here on this recording. Is like several times I've just been like, what, how is that, like, what we're trying to understand it from a different point, not to justify it, not to confirm our biases, but just to understand how it got to be this way and how it fits. Like, in understanding stuff like this it's mental gymnastics too, it's just the only way to describe it. It's mentally fatiguing. It affects the way I sleep. Like, it's weird. Like, I've tossed and turned multiple nights since like the George Floyd protests and everything that started around that started kicking up, because man, you see it every day. Everybody is talking about it and divided on it. And then all of this backdrop, the monuments and.
Yeah, well, it's like we were talking about in the 68 podcast, is that, these are issues that historically here in the United States, we could trace back to, of course, the classic civil rights movement, but you could trace it back even further than that. I mean, it's not just, it's a historical problem. It's an ethical problem. It's a human problem. I mean, it's civil rights movement. You can go to the Jim Crow stuff. You can go back to Reconstruction, Civil War. You can go back previous to that to 1619. You can do that, but it's a fundamentally human issue, and it's something that has to be dealt with. We just can't keep ignoring it, because we're going to be having the same discussion 50, 100, 200, 500 years from now, but it has to be dealt with. And we're historians, and I know I know I really come across as having an anti-Confederate bias, but and I know I've argued with people this before, because they feel that like I'm being maybe too judgmental, that I should have looked at, well, in these, you know, you're supposed to look at people in their time period and sort of what their thought, their mentality and all that. But to me, the argument about being on the right and wrong side of history, but to me, it's deeper than a historical problem. It's a human ethical issue. And I think that you can draw a good or a bad, or good and evil from that. I think you can do that. I think that's possible. And if that makes me a bad historian, so be it.
Oh, yeah, not in any way does it, man. Because here's the thing, like one of the biggest upsetting things in all this, and why I think it would lead me to toss and turn at night, is because this is a moral issue.
Right.
It has always been a moral issue. And I feel like when some of the rhetoric and things that we're, you know, tapping into and discussing, that is, I mean, the mental gymnastics people are playing to justify it. It's like, oh, like, you can use comparative suffering all you want, but it's just like, look, this is morally wrong. And when you want to bring up some other suffering or some other incident, it just doesn't work. Did Jeremy tell you the other day on somebody online was like, what about the Holocaust? Right. And he's like, oh, so you'll just jump immediately to that one, right? But you won't acknowledge this over here is being also wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, you immediately go to this other thing that's
right. It's just a complete logical fallacy. They both can be awful, you know. It's unreal. But yeah, I mean, I've had the argument, you know, but you're right. It is a completely moral discussion. It's more than, I mean, it is historical, but it's moral. And I mean, I think that's the gist of it. I think that's what's so.
I feel like we're still in that mindset of like Birth of a Nation, where I think people think if we give equal rights to Black people that they will turn on white people and kill all of us.
Yeah.
Like, why? Yeah, maybe if we keep doing this for another 100 years, they might. And if we do, like, maybe we deserve it.
Well, it was like that meme that I sent you, right? About like, you know, people saying all lives matter and all that. And it's like, you know, well, if the roles were reversed and, you know, Black Americans or Black people were in your place and white people's places, and, you know, or if you're afraid of that, you know, what does that say about you? What does that tell you about you? You know, that's, yeah.
You know, this is something, Cora showed me this video, and we might have talked about it on our podcast, but this lady that was given a talk in this auditorium, and she's like, it was a room full of white people. And she's like, you know, who in here would want to swap places with a Black person?
Right.
You know? And like, nobody stood up on that, right? Like, everybody's like, he's like, yeah, good. That's going to be the whole precedent of my talk today is that, you know, and then something I saw that come out this week, it was like, if you never had to have a Supreme Court decision, which like, this is also like with women, right? Like, so, but if you never had to have a Supreme Court decision decide whether or not you had to have equality, maybe you've got privilege.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because that's another thing. It's just a denial of white privilege, you know, which, not trying to get super into that, but it's like, well, yeah, okay. So, but let's think about all of these other sets of lives that do not matter, right? Gays, Blacks, you know, women couldn't vote. I mean, it just goes on, and it's like Native Americans. There's a lot of disenfranchised groups that were not afforded that our highest ideals in our Constitution. They're like, oh, you're going to be denied that. It's a great ideal, but it's just not for you.
But Brian, that's when you get somebody who's like the Irish.
Oh God.
The Mayans also owned slaves. Yeah. Slavery's a non-racial issue. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like I've really in the past like month have realized just how whitewashed our history has been and what we've been taught in schools. And, you know, learning, I already knew about the Tulsa massacre, but it's getting more publicity lately, and I've seen so many people that are like, I've never even heard of this.
Right. Or the Elaine massacre, which
Yeah.
right, is another instance.
Mitch Lerner, that guy Woods introduced me to, the Pueblo guy, he's writing a book about race in the military, right? So, and man, he does some, he's just written some articles. He's been writing tons of articles since the quarantine's been in, but he talks about this same stuff. So, wild. But hey, guys, I got to wrap it up. But let's just take a couple of minutes. What do we want to do next? What we wanted to go Gods and Generals Gettysburg. What kind of ideas do you guys have?
Well, I mean, if y'all want to do that, that's fine with me. I mean, Gettysburg is it's a relatively good film. You'll probably enjoy about the 4 hours of that. You won't probably enjoy the 4 hours, 5 hours of Gods and Generals. But no, I mean, I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, that works. I think that would be an excellent pairing. I mean, I feel like, I mean, I know we touched on both of these, both Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. I mean, but we could always go back to Gone with the Wind just because it's so important in terms of that. But I think the next one should be Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, because this deals with it more from a civilian perspective, and those movies are more militarily focused. So maybe, you know, that might offer us some insight into why these people were fighting. You know, why were the soldiers fighting? You know, we know about the war at home and how distorted it was in these films, you know, but yeah, I think that might be an interesting.
Who brought up Cold Mountain?
I did.
It was Thurman.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, Cold. Well,
Watched it.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay, but it's about a Southern deserter. But the first 10, 15 minutes of the film is the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg in 1864, which I mean, I don't know if any of y'all have looked into that. That's an interesting Civil War battle, but. But we could get, there's got to be a film we can find to compare to, say, or if you want to go military, you could even throw Glory into there. That's a great.
Oh yeah.
Right.
I think too, like we should look at Shenandoah. That one gets looked a lot.
Right, old school. Right. That Jimmy Stewart. Right. Was that? Gosh, I don't remember what year that was.
It's in the 60s.
60s. So I was gonna say, I thought it was the 60s, but I was kind of like in doubt. Yeah. Brian, consult the source of all knowledge, Google, for that.
I'm on it.
I'm pretty sure it's the 60s.
Right. But yeah, I mean, we could watch at some point and compare to something.
65.
Okay, 65. Right. Well, that's interesting. I mean, we could, Brian, you mentioned Django Unchained. We have 12 Years a Slave. Could watch that, you know, and maybe make some comments on it. But I think okay, maybe that you think we have enough time to cover and then do the Civil War documentary at some point. Ken Burns, The Civil War.
Yes.
But, should we just stick to 2?
I think it's a pretty solid idea.
So long, you know, especially Gods and Generals.
What do you think about
4 hours long?
What do you think about this? Maybe before or after the Ken Burns, because it sounds like we're probably going to break into about 10 films, right? Roughly, but maybe doing a recap. Like, you know, we're doing something like that. We're teaching this advanced class here at the gym. And at the end of it, we're doing it for 12 weeks. We're like, hey, we're just going to spend just a recap day, 3 hours long. That's what we're going to do. But if you want to have a podcast where we just work our way through. Oh, somebody said Good, Bad, and Ugly too.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. But if we want to work our way through and, you know, see what we come up with. I wonder also about what Outlaw Josie Wales. Would that be one that would work?
Yeah, well, I mean,
there's some Clint Eastwoods. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, so that's
Two Mules for Sister Sarah, I think, probably.
Let's just get into a bunch of spaghetti westerns, because
Yeah. But maybe we could do Good, Bad, and Ugly and Django together. That would be interesting.
Yeah, well,
because they are kind of both spaghetti, I guess. I mean, in a
yeah.
way.
Yeah, well, but like Good, Bad, and the Ugly, though, is more like Civil War is used as a backdrop. It's not, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
But with Django, I mean, even though that's set right in pre-Civil War era, in Tarantino's own envisioned Civil War, pre-Civil War era, that it's more ingrained into the story, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, with the like the mammy type that we've mentioned a few times, like when like what Tarantino does with Samuel L. Jackson's character in that movie, like when like Django first comes riding up, he's like, "Why is he on a horse?" Like he starts losing his mind. Oh man,
right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, hey, we'll have to plan it, get a date together, and I'll be talking with you, Thurman, about. I've been talking with Marie. She's super down for a 68 election episode, and I've been getting a lot of positive feedback on those 68 episodes. This guy that's coming on my podcast next week, he watched both of our 68 episodes. Then he watched Marie and my episode. Then I was like, if you like that, you should check out Thurman's thesis episode. So, like, man, people have been giving me a lot of feedback. It is kind of steady coming in. Like I've been getting shares on the one that Marie and I did. So
yeah,
we're doing good work here, guys.
We're going to get these monuments down. That is my goal.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'll be talking with you guys about some dates soon. And I really appreciate you guys collaborating. Come on the show. It's awesome talking with you.
Yeah. Thanks for having us on.
All right, cool. Well, I will send this after I get it edited. I'll send it over to you guys in Messenger if you want to share it and everything. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
All right. We'll see you.
See ya.
See you later.